before he became the name Thai parents used to scare their children. There was a boy in Rayong who never came home, and a man whose body would spend decades behind glass, while the country kept telling itself the same story. This isn't just about whether Si Ouey killed. It's about what fear does after the killing, how rumor hardens into folklore, and how a legend can outlive both the child at its center and the man blamed for it. What follows is built from the historical record, later reporting, and the voices that survived the myth, but parts of this case remain disputed, and where the record frays at the edges will say so. This episode contains violence against a child, references to mutilation and cannibalism, and discussion of human remains being displayed in public. Listener discretion is strongly advised. He didn't arrive in Thailand as a monster. He arrived as one more man trying to survive. Long before parents lowered their voices and used his name to scare children into obedience, Si Ouey was Huang Li Hui, a poor Chinese migrant from the Shantou region. Coming south in the years after war, an upheaval had already chewed through so many ordinary lives. He was not the kind of man history usually pauses for. Not rich, not connected, not powerful. Just a laborer with rough hands, limited language, and the same basic hope that has pushed people across borders forever. Maybe there's work there. Maybe there's food there. Maybe life will be a little less hard there than it was here. That hope matters, because without it, the story turns into folklore too fast. He came into a Thailand that was not exactly waiting for him with open arms. Chinese migrants had been part of Thai life for generations, but the 1940s and 1950s were tense years, and tension changes the way a country looks at people who already stand out. Suspicion was easy then. The Cold War was closing in. Anti-communist fear was growing. Chinese identity, language, and community life could draw scrutiny even when a person had nothing to do with politics at all. And for a poor migrant laborer who spoke little Thai, who moved from job to job, who depended on other Chinese speakers to help him make sense of the world around him, that kind of atmosphere could settle over a life like dust. So before the crime, before the headlines, before the myth, he was already carrying the weight of being seen as other. People who remembered him much later did not describe some larger-than-life figure. They described someone small, quiet, polite, shy. A man who worked. A man who kept to himself. A man who smiled easily, or at least tried to, in a life that probably didn't give him many reasons to. Those kinds of memories don't prove innocence. They don't erase what came later, but they matter because they remind you that the man at the center of this story did not begin as a legend. He began as a human being moving through daily life, one day at a time, on the outer edge of a country that never fully belonged to him. He took the jobs that were available to men like him: gardening, farm work, manual labor, the kind of work that leaves the body sore and the record thin. Coconut groves, fields, odd jobs, hard sun, long days, low status. The kind of life where if nothing terrible happens, almost nothing gets written down. You age, you sweat, you eat what you can, you sleep, you wake up, and the world keeps moving without ever noticing you were there. That may be the saddest thing in this whole story, because in one version of life, Si Ouey remains invisible. Just another migrant worker who passed through Thailand, worked where he could, spoke little, saved little, and disappeared into history without anyone ever building a myth around his name. But that isn't what happened. What happened is that his life crossed paths with one dead child, and from there, everything changed so completely that the man was almost buried under the story told about him. And before that collision, there was also a family in Rayong, living an ordinary day that had no reason to feel historic while it was happening. That part matters too, because the center of this story is not a legend. It is not a museum display. It is not a warning whispered to children. It is a child who was alive and then wasn't. His name was Somboon Bunyakan. Even here, the record doesn't sit still. Some later accounts say he was 8, some say 11. That may sound like a small discrepancy, but it tells you something important right away. This is not a story preserved in perfect order. It has been repeated, distorted, sensationalized, folded into folklore, and argued over for decades. So when a detail like age shifts from source to source, the honest thing is not to pretend certainty we haven't earned. The honest thing is to say it plainly, but the center holds. Somboon was a boy. He had a family. He was sent out on an ordinary errand in January 1958 in Rayong province, on the eve of a family ceremony that should have been a moment of preparation, maybe even quiet excitement. The kind of day people remember forever once something goes wrong, because afterward, every small thing feels loaded with meaning. The last words, the last glance, the simple instruction. Go out for this, come right back. And then he didn't. That is where the real dread enters, not all at once, not like thunder, more like that slow tightening in a parent's chest when minutes turn strange. First, you assume delay, then distraction, then maybe he stopped somewhere, then maybe somebody saw him. Then the mind begins doing what the mind does when love has nowhere to land. It starts racing ahead into places you don't want it to go. You can feel that in this case, even through the damaged record, a father looking, a family searching, a neighborhood suddenly becoming too large and too quiet at the same time, ordinary paths turning unfamiliar, a child's name being called out again and again into air that gives nothing back. That is the point where these stories stop being history and become something more intimate, because everybody understands that feeling, even if they've never lived it. The split second where routine collapses. The moment a normal afternoon becomes the beginning of the worst day of your life. And somewhere inside that widening fear is Si Ouey, still not yet the figure the country would later claim to know so well. The distance between what he may have been in life and what he became in public memory is almost too large to hold in one hand. A laborer on the margins, a foreigner already viewed with suspicion, a man moving through jobs, through provinces, through language he didn't fully command. Then suddenly, in the public imagination, not just a killer, but the killer, not just dangerous, but monstrous. Not just guilty of one horrifying act, but transformed into a vessel for every fear a society already had sitting there, waiting for a face. But that transformation hadn't happened yet. At this point, there is only a missing boy, a searching family, and a man whose name has not fully entered Thai memory. The tabloids haven't swollen the story. The legend hasn't hardened. The museum glass hasn't turned a body into proof. The warnings haven't reached the mouths of parents across the country. There is still a narrow space here where the story is only human. A migrant worker trying to get by. A child who should have come home. A father following fear one step at a time. And behind all of it, a country already primed to decide what kind of man it was looking at long before the argument over evidence would even begin. That's the silence just before everything breaks. Then the searching stopped being searching and became something else. Somboon's father had done what any father would do. He called out for his son, checked the usual paths, looked in the places a child might linger for a minute too long. But by the time he noticed smoke rising behind a shabby little place nearby, that ordinary fear had already turned into dread. He followed it, and what he found there would harden this story forever. Later retellings differ on details at the edges, and even Somboon's age shifts depending on the source, but the center does not move. The boy was dead, his body had been cut, and Si Ouey was found in circumstances tying him directly to that killing. That is the point where whatever else this case became, it first became real. A child was gone. A father found him too late. A man was there. And once that happened, nobody in Rayong was ever going to experience the story as something abstract or academic. It wasn't a theory. It wasn't a legend yet. It was a body, a family, a crowd, a rage that moved faster than thought. Villagers came down on the scene in fury. Police took Si Ouey into custody, and almost immediately, one horrifying crime began swelling into something larger than the evidence could comfortably hold. That happens sometimes when a country is already afraid. One dead child is unbearable enough. But one dead child can also become a kind of magnet, pulling old fears and unsolved pain toward itself. By nightfall, the question was already hanging in the air. If he did this once, had he done it before? By morning, older child murders and disappearances from other places began getting dragged into the same orbit. Cases from different provinces, different circumstances, different stages of investigations started being spoken about, as though they had finally found their answer. Not because each one had been proven, because fear loves a single face. It wants one name it can point to, one body to carry the whole load. And if later reporting has this part right, the press didn't slow that down. It accelerated it. Within days, the language turned lurid. Not just murderer, cannibal, not just violence, organs, livers, hearts, strength drawn from human flesh. It's one thing to report a brutal killing. It's another thing to build a national nightmare around it. But that seems to be exactly what happened here. The public wasn't just given a suspect in a child murder. It was handed a figure dark enough to contain every fear already waiting beneath the surface. The foreign laborer, the outsider, the man no one fully knew. The body onto which a whole society could pin its terror. And once a story takes that shape, it starts feeding itself. Parents repeat it because it works. Children remember it because it terrifies them. Headlines harden into memory. Memory hardens into folklore. Very quickly, Si Ouey was no longer just the man arrested in Rayong. He was being turned into something bigger and cleaner and more useful than a flawed, frightening human case. He was being turned into certainty. That's the part a careful telling has to resist, because there is a difference between what appears most solid in this record and what later got piled on top of it. The Rayong killing sits at the center. That appears to be the case most directly tied to him, but the larger claim, that he was a proven child cannibal responsible for a whole string of murders across Thailand, is exactly where certainty begins to break down. Later reporting and documentary work raised hard questions about how much of that broader image came from evidence and how much came from a mix of police theory, translation problems, tabloid invention, and a public already prepared to believe the worst. The interrogation matters here. By later accounts, Si Ouey spoke little Thai and was questioned through interpreters. He did not have the kind of protection we'd now expect in a serious case. Later reporting suggests he may have believed cooperation or confession could affect whether he would be sent back to China. That doesn't erase the Rayong case. It does mean we should be honest about how fragile confession evidence can become when language, power, fear, and isolation are all pressing down on the same man at once. A statement filtered through another person is already no longer fully your own. Add custody, public fury, and a foreigner's vulnerability inside a system not built for him, and certainty becomes a dangerous thing to fake. And later, reviews didn't just question the atmosphere. They questioned specifics. Some of the broader allegations did not line up neatly with the physical record people thought they remembered. In at least one earlier killing later drawn into the Si Ouey legend, other men had already been convicted. In some retellings, the organ-taking details that became central to the myth do not hold up cleanly when revisited. That does not turn him into an innocent man by magic. It does something more important than that. It forces the story back into human scale. It says, one case may be strong, but the legend around it grew far beyond what we can honestly prove. Still, honesty cuts both ways. There's a temptation in old cases like this to swing from one myth into another. First, the monster myth, then later, the martyr myth. But the truth is harder and less satisfying than either. Somboon was dead. His family had to live with that. The scene in Rayong was horrifying enough on its own. Nothing about the later myth-making should make us soften that reality or smooth it over, because the broader story became contaminated. A dead child stays a dead child even when the public story around his death becomes distorted. That's why the courtroom matters, even if it didn't really stand a chance against the public narrative already forming outside it. By the time the case reached judgment, the country had already done what frightened countries do. It had made up its mind. Si Ouey was prosecuted for the Rayong killing, convicted, sentenced to death, and executed by firing squad at Bang Kwang prison in September 1959. Whatever doubts later grew around the larger legend, the state's answer in that moment was absolute. This was the man, this was the verdict, and this was the end it chose for him. But it wasn't the end. After the execution, Siriraj Medical School took custody of his body for study. Then study turned into display. The body was embalmed, placed behind glass at the medical museum, and left there for decades, until the man was no longer just part of a case file or a court record. He became an exhibit, a warning, a face generations of children could be brought to see with their own eyes. That may be the part of the story that stays with people the longest, because a trial ends, a sentence ends, even an execution ends. But a body in a glass case keeps speaking long after the law is done with it. It tells the public, look, here he is. This is what evil looked like. This is what fear looked like. This is what happens when a country decides a man should go on serving a purpose even after death. Over time, that display did something the courtroom alone never could. It fused punishment to folklore. It made the legend feel physical, real, settled. And once that happened, the story no longer belonged only to police, prosecutors, or judges. It moved into homes, into schoolyards, into the mouths of parents trying to control frightened or stubborn children. If you don't behave, Si Ouey will come. If that warning didn't work, the museum was there, standing by, with the body itself turned into proof. That is how a criminal case becomes culture. Not through one headline, through repetition. Through fear handed down so many times, it starts to feel older than the facts. But repetition is not the same thing as truth. By the late 2000s, the spell began to weaken. Activists, journalists, and later documentary work reopened questions that had been left buried for years. An online campaign pushed Siriraj to confront the way it had framed him. And in May 2019, the museum removed the word cannibal from the display. Soon after, the body itself was taken out of public view. That was not an acquittal. It did not undo the Rayong conviction, but it was the first real institutional sign that even the authorities could no longer pretend the legend was as clean as the old label made it sound. And then, after more than 60 years of being looked at, named, judged, and used, he was finally given a funeral. On July 23, 2020, his remains were cremated at Wat Bang Prak Thai in Nonthaburi, near Bang Kwang Prison. Buddhist monks chanted. Corrections officials attended. The fire was lit. After all those years in the glass box, after all those decades as a national warning, the body at last became ash. Whatever anyone believes about the full reach of his crimes, that moment carried a different kind of gravity. Not innocence, not exoneration. Something quieter than that. The return of a measure of human dignity to a man whose body had outlived his case and been made to carry a myth for generations. And maybe that is where the story becomes hardest to hold. None of that changes the one fact that should remain untouched. Somboon was a child, and he was taken from the people who loved him. But the other truth sits there too, just as stubbornly. A society can turn fear into certainty faster than certainty deserves, especially when the man at the center is poor, foreign, isolated, and easy to flatten into a symbol. So what you're left with is not a neat ending. It's two dead lives bound together by one crime and everything that came after it. One boy whose name should never be swallowed by folklore. One man whose name became folklore so completely that the public story around him almost consumed the evidence, the trial, the body, and even the memory of what was actually proven. And this is where the ground starts to give a little. Up to now, there are things the record can carry with some weight. From here on out, we're dealing with the part of the story that lives in argument, memory, rumor, later rereadings, internet debate, and the kind of public chatter that can be revealing without ever becoming proof. That matters because this is exactly where people tend to get reckless. They start treating suspicion like evidence, or they start treating doubt like exoneration. This story doesn't deserve either shortcut. A lot of the modern rethinking seems to flare back up in 2019, when a social media post criticizing the museum display and the old cannibal label hit a nerve and spread fast. From there, the argument widened. People started asking not just whether the display was undignified, but whether Thailand had spent decades preserving a legend that had grown much larger than the narrowest provable core of the case. That conversation pulled in questions about xenophobia, spectacle, and whether a dead man had been made to carry a whole country's fear long after the law had already done its work. And once people started pulling at that thread, all the old pressure points came back. You see, one camp say the Rayong scene is enough. Enough for guilt. Enough to stop talking. Enough to dismiss everything that came later as noise. And then you see the other camp worrying at all the places where the story seems too smooth to be trusted. The interpreter, the lack of legal protection during questioning, the old claims that some confessions may have been shaped by fear, language, or false expectations. The later talk that another man may have been implicated in one strand of the wider story. The retired investigators claim that at least one earlier killing pointed elsewhere. The suspicion that once police and tabloids had a foreign suspect in hand, it became easy to hang a backlog of public terror on the same body. Those are real points in the modern debate. But they are debate, not verdict, not proof, not something we should dress up as settled fact just because it makes for cleaner storytelling. And the internet, of course, only sharpens the split. In English language true crime spaces, the argument often gets reduced to two blunt positions. On one side, monster caught red-handed. On the other, Cold War scapegoat. Both are emotionally satisfying. Both are too neat, because the first can flatten all later doubt into denial, and the second can flatten a dead child into context. Neither one really honors how messy this case actually is. Thai public chatter feels more layered, but not always calmer. Some of it is deeply personal, especially when older voices surface, saying they or their families never believed the full Cannibal story in the first place. Some of it is cultural memory, less about the crime itself, and more about how the story settled into daily Thai life so deeply that many people inherited the fear long before they ever encountered the facts. Some of it is anger at the museum, at the tabloids, at the old appetite for spectacle. And some of it is still pure folklore, still carrying the liver-eater legend forward, as if repetition itself were evidence. That's what makes this part so revealing. You're not just hearing theories about a crime. You're hearing a society argue with its own memory. There's also a darker possibility sitting underneath a lot of the public chatter, and it needs to be handled carefully, not stated as fact, not leaned on too hard, just acknowledged for what it is, a suspicion that the story works so well because it gave post-war Thailand exactly the kind of villain it was ready to believe in. Poor, foreign, Chinese, isolated, easy to fear, easy to simplify, easy to turn into a warning. That doesn't prove a frame-up. It does help explain why the legend may have traveled faster, lasted longer, and hardened more completely than the evidence alone should have allowed. And that's probably the most honest place to leave this part of it. Not with a dramatic reveal, not with some fake certainty pulled from forum threads or social posts, just with the recognition that the case kept mutating after the verdict, and that much of what people now argue about says as much about Thailand's fear, memory, and myth-making as it does about the man at the center of it. So when we step back out of this softer ground, the only responsible thing to carry with us is this. Public chatter can show you where the story still hurts, where it still divides, where the old legend still breathes. It cannot, by itself, tell you what was finally true. The most honest way to end this story is without pretending it closes cleanly. A boy named Somboon was taken from the world in a way no family should ever have to endure. That remains at the center, and it should remain there. Around that loss, another story took hold, one shaped by fear, spectacle, and the human need to turn uncertainty into something that feels settled. Because that's the danger in stories like this. Not just violence, not just injustice, but the way memory can harden around the loudest version of events and leave very little room for doubt, mercy, or nuance. A child becomes a symbol, a man becomes a monster, and somewhere in between, truth gets worn down by time, fear, and retelling. So maybe the real weight of this story is not in the old warning, it's in the silence behind it. The silence of a family that lost a child. The silence of a man whose name became bigger than the record could safely hold. The silence that settles in when you realize a nation can preserve a myth for generations and still never fully answer the question underneath it. If this episode stayed with you, and if you value this kind of careful, fact-first storytelling, the kind that slows down when the record gets shaky instead of pretending certainty, follow the show. Share this episode with someone who cares about the stories behind the headlines, and keep listening with a little more patience for the places where history doesn't come to us clean. This episode was built from later reporting, archival coverage, and documentary reconstruction. including work from Thai PBS and Truth Never Dies, along with reporting from Chaos at English, The Nation, Coconuts Bangkok, Bangkok Post, The Standard, and international wire services that revisited the museum controversy, the removal of the Cannibal label, and the cremation that finally brought the public display to an end. And before we leave this one, let Somboon be remembered not as part of a legend, not as a detail inside a myth, but as a child who should have been allowed to grow up. Until next time, may Somboon be remembered with tenderness and with the dignity every stolen child deserves, where the land remembers what others try to forget.